And here's Nell. This is, you're going to get a real Nimbin here. She's a terrific girl and runs the Happy, you are called Happy still, aren't you? Or High?
We're definitely
the High got taken out of Happy Herbs, but here's still it's Happy High Herbs.
Yeah. Thank you, Michael. And I'd really again like to thank Michael. I know he was just thanked, but I was thinking today I want to thank Michael and all the rest of the crew that are organising these events and doing so much for the cannabis movement for such a long time, and really take my hat off to you all. So I'm here to talk a little bit about the regulation process and the standardisation of cannabis medicine. And I'm going to talk a little bit about this from a historical perspective today. So last time I was here at the conference, I'm just going to lift this up a bit. Okay? So last time I was here, I was talking a bit about herbal energetics and why intuition is so important when we're using herbs for healing. But I'm not going to talk about that this time. The reason is that last time I was here, I noticed that there was a lot of discussion that really had a really distinctive them versus us kind of flavour to it. And, you know, so there was a lot of them, the bad corporations and the evil government and the evil TGA and the evil Office of Drug Control versus us good guys. And I thought a lot about this. And the more I thought about it, the more I reflected that not only is that basically quite a negative perspective, but it's actually not a particularly good strategy. It's not a particularly effective strategy for getting good quality herbal medicine out to the people. And it's not about winning here. It's about healing. It's about getting really good quality herbs out to the people to heal our bodies and our minds and our souls and our communities and our connection with nature. So what's happening here in Australia is that now you probably will get a legal cannabis medicine, but it's probably going to be a highly standardised medicine that's really tightly regulated and controlled. So the purpose of this talk is to consider how, given such a restrictive regulatory framework, we might strategise a bit more effectively. And to do that, I'm going to look a little bit at the history, and I'm going to go right back here to the witch hunts. And I'm going to say that this is part one of a presentation because I'm only going to talk for about 20 minutes, and I just want to look a little bit first at the historical angles of how we have this regulatory framework here in Australia and the rest of the world. So, obviously the witches were the healers, the people who had the knowledge about plants. And if you're not familiar with the word paradigm, because what we have is this polarity in paradigms, if you're not familiar with the word paradigm, what paradigm means is that it's a set of beliefs, values and assumptions that constrain the way that we are able to analyse and understand scientific data. And what I'm trying to say is that even though some of us might think that scientific data is neutral, it's almost always understood within powerful belief structures that operate at the subconscious level. And when these beliefs, either in individuals or in the collective, are pathological in nature, what we get is dangerous paradigms. And I think that's what we're seeing today. So organisations like the Therapeutic Goods Association or Therapeutic Goods Administration, the TGA, and the Office of Drug Control that's now been set up to regulate cannabis medicine, use a system of scientific measurements that is entirely based on a materialistic worldview. So this is a worldview that perceives the universe to be a random, meaningless collection of atoms bouncing around in space, and that consciousness is a byproduct of the neurobiological processes of the human brain. So their lens on cannabis can only really be seen through the molecular and chemical composition. That framework can have no real understanding. And don't get me wrong, that framework is incredibly useful, as you have heard from the speakers today. It's very useful to understand things in that materialistic way. But it does miss the point that these herbs can heal us on very deep levels in our spirits and our souls. And I think that needs to really be brought into the debate. Because what we're seeing now with the new paradigm from such diverse fields as things like quantum physics and energy medicine, transpersonal psychology, and medical intuition, which is a new field in the medical intuitive science, is that basically materialistic science alone is an imbalanced way to understand how healing actually works and how plants and herbs work. Now, we have a name for it in the materialistic paradigm. It's called the placebo effect. And the placebo effect in using, when people are healed using these plants, is about 40% of people. But it's not just pushed away as though it's a sort of meaningless thing, but the placebo effect is how scientists who don't understand the energetic nature of medicine explain away a huge proportion of the healing that's actually taking place. And I really do believe that this energy medicine is the future. Consciousness is not a byproduct of the human brain. Plants, humans, in fact all living things are part of an intelligent, balanced and conscious force that unites all creation. And I think that the irony here is that this type of perceiving reality, this materialistic worldview, is now coming full cycle to actually giving us new tools to be able to understand some of these really deep energetic matrices that are working in our consciousness when we're using plants like cannabis or ayahuasca or mushrooms. So I'd like to just take a minute to look a little bit about how we developed this materialistic paradigm of science, because it wasn't how it was. It's not how the witches perceived healing. And I want to talk a little bit about a man called Sir Francis Bacon, who is still considered to this day the father of modern science. Because I really want to unveil the psychology that's involved here. Bacon was born in 1561, and this was what historians call the modern era of history. We're now in the postmodern era, but this was way back in history, at the beginning of this modern era. He was one of the most influential scientists, politicians, and philosophers of his time. Now, this guy was so powerful that when he was arrested at the end of his career on 23 charges of corruption and chucked in the Tower of London, his bail was set at £40,000. Can you imagine how much money that would have been in 1621? It gives you a scale of the level of corruption that this guy was involved in. This is the father of the scientific model that the TGA and all of those organisations now base their science on. So he developed a system of scientific inquiry called the empirical method. And basically, empiricism is a theory that in order to understand nature, the only real way you can understand it is through your five senses. And this is still the foundation of mainstream science to this day. And they still dominate the scientific paradigm, like I said, of all these organisations. So what is the problem here? I think it's because most of us here would probably know that the healing effects of a plant like cannabis, the deep connection that you can have with a plant like ayahuasca, cannot be explained or understood by the five senses alone. It's just a ridiculous idea. So Bacon argued that for nature to be properly understood, it had to be seen as being devoid of any inherent consciousness or intelligence. To study nature empirically, it cannot be seen to have any independent purpose or intention, any intrinsic meaning, or any capacity for communication or spiritual dimension. Scientific empiricism gave us a cold, mechanistic world, where nature could be quantified, standardized, measured, reduced, and broken down to ever more and more smaller parts. What we now call reductionism. It was a world where you could just cut down a bunch of trees because it was just about monetary value. And you could standardize a herbal medicine for sale because there was no sacred gift of healing from Mother Nature. Now, don't get me wrong, because I love science. I'm a scientist from heart. I come from a long lineage of doctors, and I really know the value and how useful science can be. But I do think that this way of approaching healing and plants is incredibly out of balance with reality. I want to go a little bit deeper into the history here, because I think it's so fascinating to understand where empiricism comes from. So I want to look at one of Francis Bacon's very best friends, and that was King James I of England. Because I think if we understand a little bit more about the psychology that birthed the paradigm, we might see that this indeed was a pathology, and that we're still living with the results of that today on a massive scale. And it needs to be named, and it needs to be unmasked. So from 1617 to 1621, Bacon was Lord Chancellor to James I of England. Now, it might not be relevant, but both men are considered by historians to have been homosexual, and certainly they had a very difficult relationship with women through their lives, which may have been of some relevance. But I'll tell you the story. James found a way. When Bacon was put in jail at the Tower of London, he gave him a get out of jail free card. So Bacon didn't even have to stand trial for the charges. So anyway, back to James. James was actually the son of Queen Mary of Scots, and she was beheaded by his father when he was just 2 years old. So he was raised in a damp, cold Scottish castle and primed for power as King of Scotland. And when he became a teenager, he was actually responsible for the first systematised enclosure of indigenous lands, where they basically closed down the lands of Scotland, pushed out the indigenous people, legislated so that 90% of the Scottish lands became into the hands of the lords. And you might wonder why that's relevant today, but that's still the case. 90% of the Scottish land is still in the hands of the descendants of that original grab for power. And so when James then became King of England, he was not only responsible for the massive rise in the power of the church, which is relevant to the witch hunts, he actually even commissioned his very own Bible, the King James edition. Okay? Now he also, it's quite astounding how many things happened here that are relevant to today. He also actually established the treaties for the first international trade routes of the first multinational corporation, which was the East India Company. But most relevant to the issue of herbs and herbal medicine is that James was obsessed with the hunting and capture of witches. Yeah? So Bacon and James were part of this mindset. And that James himself actually presided over the first witch trials in Scotland, which were the first witch trials in England, and he was actually even presiding over the torture. Now, the first witch to be tried in Scotland was tried for the charge of an unexplainable ability to heal. This was an unexplainable ability to heal within the scientific paradigm that Bacon himself had developed. Now these women, mostly women, some men, endured days of torture. They had their nails pulled out, they had their feet crushed in boots, until they confessed to the crime of fraternising with the devil to explain why these people could heal people with their energy. It must be demonic, according to James and Bacon, the forefathers of modern science. So, why is this relevant to today? Well, we are still living with the results of this massive push for power. That was a time in history where the church and the state were just making their first grab for power. And we're now living at the absolute peak of that wave in history. So I think it's really important to understand where we've come from, if we're going to understand where we're going, and how these paradigms function and what their roots are. So empiricism was basically developed as a science of control. It was developed as a science of oppression, basically, within that framework. And, I think the results of that today we see all around us in the sort of mindless destruction of nature and the incredible unwellness in the psychologies and the bodies of so many people in these in our countries. So I hope that most of you can see that there's some relevance here. And obviously the roots of scientific empiricism probably go much further back into history to the myth of the fall and beyond, but I really want to unmask the dark roots of scientific empiricism, and by doing that I think we make an important stand for a more intelligent approach, especially in this day and age, to understanding nature and understanding plant consciousness and understanding what healing really is. We need a method of understanding and incorporating herbal medicines into society that at least has a basic respect for nature, as an intelligent and aware consciousness, as part of a unified field of consciousness. Look, there's so much more I could say about the denigration of the feminine principle and of intuition and of the body and of sexuality, but I think the point that the forefathers of the mentality of the organisations like the TGA and like the Office of Drug Control really were dark and dangerous psychologies. So I just want to get back now to what I said at the start of the presentation about this them versus us psychology that I just see really present in the movement here. Because from where I stand, that them versus us psychology is just more separation. It's just more division, and that disempowers us. Organisations like the TGA and the Office of Drug Control, yes, we can say that in some ways that is a system of understanding nature that, yeah, while it's useful to some extent, it does have barbaric and sort of archaic roots that we really need to upgrade. And I think that that's actually a valid strategy to start arguing, because we have science now that really does explain a lot of how these more evolved forms of consciousness really work, and they are a science. It's not some sort of hocus pocus anymore. We have incredible understanding now and incredible opportunities for real healing, planetary healing. Are the people that work for the TGA and for pharmaceutical companies really evil? I don't think so. They're probably just like you and me. They're doing their best within a dysfunctional paradigm, and some of them probably even think that whole plant medicine is a really good idea. We've got to move beyond this mentality of separation in the movement. That's what I believe. So what is an effective strategy? You know, a friend of mine who's a political campaigner said you always go gentle on the people and heavy on the issue. You know, so what are the issues? I mean, from where I stand, it's like most people are actually already convinced that cannabis is good medicine. I don't think we need to really convince any more people. There's a majority of people that believe that now. But where we really need to target our strategies, if we're going to have effective strategies, is on the actual process of standardization itself. Because even though standardization presents itself as a sort of neutral scientific framework, the standardizations that we see across all society, not only with plants and herbs, are actually a social justice issue. Because who decides? Are they elected? No. Are they scientific experts? Okay, well, what are they basing their research on? And so, next time I'm here if I get invited back, I'd really like to look really closely at the regulatory bodies in Australia and the standardisation process itself. And just really start to pull that apart, because I think there's a lot to really be understood. It's a very, very complex situation here in Australia around regulation for all plants. Really chaotic and disorganised system. So, yeah, I'd like to come back and maybe look a little bit more at that. Just to end on a really personal note, I come from a really hardcore scientific background. You know, I was raised with absolutely no spirituality. And so when I started using plants like cannabis and psychedelic plants like ayahuasca and psilocybin, which are also plants which have been condemned, it was really, really hard for me to understand that consciousness belonged in these plants. These plants were conscious beings. And that was really difficult for me to understand, and it was really actually quite painful and traumatic. But now that I understand the beauty and the healing and the incredible intelligence that is flowing through the world of plants, I am absolutely committed to doing everything that I can to make medicines available for people in this world. Like I've had access, and very lucky to live here and have access to this healing. So blessings on everyone's healing, blessings on all of our healing.